The friendship between Bing Crosby and Louis Armstrong was, in the specific social landscape of 1940s America, not an obvious thing. It was not the friendship of two people in the same world, not the natural proximity of neighbors or colleagues, or people whose lives had been shaped by the same set of circumstances. It was the friendship of two people whose worlds, by the rules of the America they lived in, were supposed to remain separate, and who had, through the specific medium of music and the particular chemistry of two people who recognized something in each other, arrived at something genuine anyway. Bing Crosby was, by the mid-1940s, the most commercially successful entertainer in America. This was not an assessment requiring much qualification. By the numbers, record sales, radio listeners, box office receipts, Crosby occupied a position in the landscape of American popular entertainment that had no clear rival. He sold more records than anyone else. His radio program reached audiences that the other radio programs of the era did not approach. His films were among the most commercially successful of their era. He was, in the specific vocabulary of the entertainment industry, the biggest name. Armstrong's commercial stature was different and in some ways more complicated. He was internationally celebrated in a way that Crosby was not. The jazz world's regard for Armstrong crossed national and linguistic boundaries that Crosby's popularity did not penetrate with the same depth. He was, among musicians, regarded with a specific quality of respect that was different from the commercial admiration that surrounded Crosby. The respect of peers who understood what it had taken to do what he had done, who recognized in his recordings and performances the achievement of something that could not be explained by access to the right material or the right promotional infrastructure, but only by the presence of something extraordinary. The two men had been aware of each other since the 1930s, when their careers first intersected in the specific geography of the American entertainment landscape. The radio programs and films and nightclub circuits through which celebrity of sufficient scale eventually brought people into the same professional spaces. They had performed together, in the informal way of entertainers whose paths cross in the normal course of things. But what developed between them was not simply the professional familiarity of two people in the same industry. It was something more specific and more personal, and it found its clearest expression not on a stage or in a recording studio, but on a golf course. Both men played golf. They played with the particular seriousness of people who use a leisure activity as the container for something they need. The outdoor hours, the specific combination of competition and companionship, the particular quality of a game that occupies enough of a person's attention to crowd out everything else for the duration of play. They played together when their schedules allowed. They played at courses and in specific arrangements that required a certain kind of navigating in the America of the 1940s. The public dimension of the friendship, the collaboration on recordings and radio and film that overlapped with the private one, produced work that those who study the careers of both men point to as among the most natural and least calculated interracial collaboration in American popular entertainment of the era. When Crosby and Armstrong performed together, the ease was audible. The specific quality of musical interaction that occurs between performers who know each other well enough to have moved beyond the careful professionalism of a first collaboration, who have stopped managing the interaction and started simply inhabiting it, was present in what they produced together. Crosby's baritone and Armstrong's trumpet found each other in a way that those who heard them describe as sounding like something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. What Crosby did that most white entertainers of his era did not do extended beyond the specific arrangements of golf courses. He advocated, in the specific contexts where his advocacy mattered, in conversations with producers, with label executives, with the people who made decisions about the commercial landscape that Armstrong was navigating, for Armstrong's participation in projects and arrangements that Armstrong's race would otherwise have excluded him from. He did this quietly, without announcement, in the way that people with influence exercise it when they regard the exercise as simple common sense, rather than as an act requiring fanfare. He also, in the public record, said things about Armstrong that went beyond the courteous acknowledgement that the entertainment industry expected white performers to offer their black peers. He said that Armstrong was the most naturally gifted musician he had ever worked with. He said that what Armstrong did with a melody was something he had studied and not been able to account for, that it was not reducible to technique or to experience, but to something more fundamental that he had simply learned to recognize and to make room for when it was present. These were not the statements of professional courtesy. They were the statements of someone who had listened carefully and had a precise sense of what he was listening to. Armstrong returned this regard in the terms he used for things he valued, directly, warmly, without elaboration. He said Crosby was a musician who understood music. In the specific vocabulary of Armstrong's assessments of his peers, this was high and specific praise, not the kind he distributed widely, not the kind he offered as courtesy. He said Crosby was a musician who understood music, which meant Crosby had ears, which meant the music that happened when they were in the same room was music that both of them were making. The friendship between them was not without its limits, and those limits were not difficult to identify. Crosby could open golf courses and arrange recording sessions and say correct things in industry conversations and treat Armstrong with the specific quality of respect that Armstrong deserved and that most of the people around him did not consistently offer. What Crosby could not do was change the structure of the world that made these gestures necessary. The golf courses that required opening would still require opening the following week. The industry conversations that required Crosby's advocacy would still require it. The architecture of the world that the friendship existed inside was not altered by the friendship. The specific geography of golf in 1940s America was not simple for a black man, even a black man of Armstrong's stature. The country clubs and golf courses that the commercial landscape of the era made available to people of Crosby's position were, in many cases, not places where Armstrong could simply arrive and play. The membership structures, the guest policies, the informal arrangements of exclusion that the formal rules sometimes expressed openly and sometimes encoded more quietly. These were part of the landscape of Armstrong's life in the way that they were part of the landscape of the life of every black American of the era, regardless of their professional achievement. Crosby was aware of this. What he did about it, in the specific, practical, unannounced way that some people address specific injustices in the circumstances of their own lives, without framing it as activism or as an occasion for public statement, was to make sure that the courses they played together were courses where Armstrong could play. To use his influence, which in the specific economy of the 1940s entertainment world was very considerable influence, to arrange the conditions under which the friendship could be practiced. He did not frame this as a political act. He did not announce it. He simply did it, in the way that people do things they regard as obvious, when the obvious thing is within their power to arrange. Armstrong understood what Crosby was doing, and he received it with the specific quality of gratitude that people express for things that should not require gratitude, things that are simply correct, things that ought to be the ordinary state of affairs, things that the world has made into something extraordinary through the specific arrangement of its injustices. He was grateful. He was also, in the private space of his own understanding, aware that Crosby's ability to arrange these conditions was itself a product of the same structure that made them necessary, that the world in which a white entertainer's social influence could open a golf course for a black friend was a world that required the social influence to begin with. This did not reduce the friendship. It simply placed it in its context, which was the context of two men who were friends in the specific America they lived in, and not in some hypothetical America where the context did not apply. The friendship was real. Its conditions were the conditions of the actual world. Armstrong navigated those conditions the way he navigated everything, with a precise awareness of what they were and a decision not to allow them to determine the whole of what was possible within them. What was possible in the friendship with Crosby was considerable. The two men talked about music in the way that two people who have spent their lives inside the music talk about it, not as fans discussing something they admire, but as practitioners discussing something they understand from the inside. Crosby was not a jazz musician in Armstrong's sense, but he was a musician of genuine sophistication, who understood the craft of what Armstrong was doing at a level that not everyone who admired Armstrong could reach. The conversations had in them the specific quality of exchange between people who are operating in related areas of the same domain, and who recognize each other's expertise. When Bing Crosby died in 1977, he was one of the most documented entertainers in American history. The recordings, the films, the radio programs, the profiles and interviews and biographical accounts that had accumulated across 5 decades of a career at the top of the commercial landscape had produced a public record of considerable scope. And in that record, Louis Armstrong's name appeared in a particular way, not simply as a musical collaborator, not simply as a contemporary whose work Crosby had acknowledged, but as a friend, a real one. Armstrong had died in 1971, 6 years before Crosby. The friendship, which had lasted across 3 decades and had been conducted in the specific conditions of the America they shared, had ended with Armstrong's death in the way that friendships end when one person goes ahead of the other. Crosby, in the years between Armstrong's death and his own, spoke about Armstrong with the specific quality of someone who had lost a person and not simply a colleague. What the friendship between these two men reveals about both of them, and about the specific conditions of American entertainment in the era they shared, is something that resists the clean verdicts that their respective public images sometimes invite. Crosby was not simply a privileged white entertainer who extended courtesy to a black peer from a position of unchallenged power. Armstrong was not simply a black musician who received the benefits of proximity to white privilege without the structural conditions changing. Both of these things were true, and they were insufficient. The friendship was also simply two people who recognized something in each other and made the choice to cultivate what that recognition produced. The golf courses and the conversations about music, and the warmth that was audible in the recordings they made together, and the specific things Crosby said about Armstrong, and the specific things Armstrong said about Crosby. These were not the products of structural analysis. They were the products of two people who found that they were glad to be in each other's company. The structure of the world they lived in made that gladness more complicated than it should have been. It required arrangements that it should not have required. It operated within limits that it should not have had to operate within. And they cultivated it anyway. Crosby, by using his influence to make the conditions of the friendship workable. Armstrong, by bringing to the friendship the same quality he brought to everything, the precise awareness of what it was, and the decision to receive it fully as the real thing it was, without pretending that the world outside it had stopped being what it was. The golf course photographs from the 1940s, the ones that exist in the archives, Two men in period-appropriate golf attire on California fairways, comfortable in each other's company, are not photographs of a simple thing. They are photographs of something that required effort to make possible, and that was, despite that effort, worth making possible. Both men knew this. Both men showed up for it. Bing Crosby was the most commercially successful entertainer in America. Louis Armstrong was the most celebrated trumpet player in the world. They played golf together every chance they got. In the specific America of the 1940s, this required things it should not have required. They arranged those things. They showed up. And the friendship was real. Which, in the world they were living in, was not a small thing to say.